I stood there, frozen, watching the plane disappear into the sky, my son's flight taking him farther from us with every passing second. My granddaughter's tiny hand gripped mine tightly, her pleading eyes filled with more fear than I had ever seen. "Please, Grandma, don't make me go back there," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the hum of the airport. As the crowd bustled around us, I realized then, this was no longer just a visit. This was a desperate cry for help, and I was the only one who could answer. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Maggie stood at the terminal, her arms wrapped around Lily in a tight, lingering hug. She inhaled the familiar scent of her granddaughter's hair, the comforting fragrance of lavender shampoo. She wanted to hold on forever, to keep Lily close, to shield her from whatever was waiting at home. But the harsh reality of the airport buzzed around them, the clink of rolling suitcases, the murmur of departing passengers, the whir of distant overhead announcements. The world was moving, and Paul was leaving. "Be good, Lily," Paul called over his shoulder, a tight smile on his lips. He didn't pause, just adjusted his briefcase and started walking toward the gate. "We'll be back in a couple of days." Maggie's gaze lingered on her son's back, the familiar unease crawling through her chest. Paul's words were always so rehearsed, so distant. She hadn't even been able to get a proper hug from him, nothing but a quick peck on the cheek before he vanished into the crowd. She turned her attention back to Lily, who was holding on a little tighter now, as if she could feel the impending separation too. Heather, standing beside them, was busy scrolling through her phone, her face a mask of irritation. She barely glanced at Lily. "Come on, we don't have all day," she said, her voice laced with a kind of sharpness Maggie had learned to ignore. Heather was always too preoccupied with appearances, too focused on her next set of plans to really see what was going on. "Mom!" Lily tugged at Maggie's sleeve, her voice small, hesitant. "Please don't make me go home." Maggie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to say something, anything, to make it all stop, to pull Lily out of this nightmare and take her somewhere safe, somewhere warm. But she couldn't. At least, not yet. Her hands trembled as she placed them on Lily's shoulders, pulling her close for a brief moment of quiet between the chaos of the terminal. Maggie's heart cracked. She could see the strain in Lily's eyes, the exhaustion that came from a home that felt like a war zone, a place where love had been replaced with indifference. The fight in her eyes, the fear that she was about to be left in that cold, unwelcoming place again, tore Maggie apart. Before she could say anything, Heather snapped, her voice sharp, cutting through the fragile silence like a blade. "Come on, we're leaving," she said, already turning toward the exit, her heels clicking impatiently against the polished floor. Maggie's chest tightened. She wanted to tell Heather that Lily wasn't some accessory to be shoved around or ignored, that she was a child who needed love and protection. But she knew better than to waste her breath on that now. Heather wasn't listening. She hadn't been for years. Lily looked up at Maggie, her eyes wide with unshed tears, her lips trembling. Maggie could see the ache in her, how much she longed for a place where she mattered, where someone truly cared. Maggie's own heart swelled with a fierce protectiveness. "Don't worry, sweet girl," Maggie whispered, her voice a fragile promise. "I'll always be here for you." But Lily's gaze flickered toward Heather, the woman who had given birth to her, the woman who was supposed to care for her, but who had long since let that role slip away. Lily hesitated for a moment, her lips parted as if to say something, but the words never came. She simply nodded, her small form still shaking as she walked reluctantly beside Heather. Maggie watched them go, the ache in her chest growing with every step. She stayed rooted in place, her hands still trembling. It was as though the world had shifted, leaving her standing in a spot that was too still, too silent. Her mind was already racing, thoughts colliding, her protective instincts taking over. She had to do something. The way Lily's voice had cracked, the raw desperation in her plea, it wasn't just a childish whim. Something was terribly wrong, and Maggie knew it. She didn't need to be told. She had spent enough years in a hospital, tending to wounds and broken hearts, to recognize when something was truly broken. She didn't know what she would do yet, but she would not, could not stand by and watch her granddaughter suffer. Not if there was anything she could do to stop it. As she walked away from the terminal, her thoughts darkened, her resolve tightening. Maggie's heart was heavy, but there was a flicker of something else in her chest now, something burning, a quiet promise. She would protect Lily. She would never let Heather or Paul destroy the bright, loving child she was. Maggie might not know the full story yet, but she knew this. She would fight. And that fight had already begun. The rain came down in a steady, relentless sheet, a mirror to the heaviness that weighed on Maggie's chest. She drove slowly, wipers swishing back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm, the murmur of the tires against wet pavement the only sound inside the car. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed out the window, lost in thought. The lights from the street lamps cast fleeting shadows across her face, illuminating the deep sadness that Maggie couldn't ignore. Maggie glanced at her granddaughter, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Lily hadn't said a word since they left the airport. She hadn't even cried, just stared quietly into the rain, her small hands folded in her lap. Maggie's heart twisted at the sight. This wasn't the Lily she remembered. The spark in her eyes had dimmed, replaced with something much darker. "Do you want to talk, sweetheart?" Maggie's voice was soft, hesitant. Not wanting to push too hard but needing to bridge the growing silence between them. Lily shook her head slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine, Grandma." Maggie's heart tightened. She wasn't fine. Not by a long shot. She could see it in the way Lily held herself, in the hollow way she spoke. Maggie longed to reach out, to pull her close and erase whatever had hurt her, but she knew better. She had to let Lily open up in her own time. They pulled into the driveway of Maggie's small home. The house was a sanctuary of warmth and quiet, a stark contrast to the cold, chaotic atmosphere of the Collins household. Lily stepped out of the car, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm that Maggie could already feel brewing. Inside, the house was cozy, the familiar smell of herbs and baking filling the air, a comfort Maggie hoped would give Lily a brief respite from whatever had been haunting her. Maggie hung up her raincoat and led Lily into the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The house was small, but it was filled with love. The kind of love Maggie had always made sure to show, even in the absence of her late husband. Lily walked over to the couch, sinking into the cushions without a word. Maggie set down her bag and moved to the kitchen to prepare something warm, maybe soup, maybe tea. Anything to soothe the silence that had settled between them. As she worked, she could feel the weight of Lily's gaze on her, but she couldn't quite bring herself to meet it. Not yet. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, Lily spoke again, her voice fragile, like the last thread of a dream. "They don't talk to me, Grandma. They just fight." Maggie's hands stilled, the knife she was holding trembling in her grip. She hadn't been ready for that confession, not yet. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting Lily's for the first time since they'd left the airport. The pain in her granddaughter's eyes was unmistakable. It was raw and unguarded. Maggie's throat tightened, but she swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I know, honey," she whispered. "I know." Lily looked away quickly, wiping her eyes in a subtle motion that made Maggie's heart ache. She wanted to rush over, to hold her, to make everything better, but she knew that wouldn't work. Not now. Lily needed to feel safe first, to feel like she wasn't alone. Maggie finished preparing the tea, placing a steaming cup on the coffee table in front of Lily. She sat beside her, close but not too close, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. They didn't need to speak. Not yet. Maggie glanced around the room, letting her gaze linger on the old family photos scattered on the walls. Photos of a time when things had felt simpler, when Lily had been a little girl full of laughter and light. There was nothing simple about the house they'd just left behind. Nothing warm. Maggie knew there was more to Lily's silence than just a typical teenage mood. She could feel it deep in her bones, the weight of neglect pressing down on her like an invisible force. When they finally moved to the bedroom, Maggie helped Lily get ready for bed, making sure she was comfortable under the heavy quilt that had been passed down from her mother. She tucked the blanket tightly around Lily's shoulders, smoothing the edges down gently. She wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Heather had never understood the depth of Maggie's love for Lily, never seen the quiet, fragile bond they shared. Maggie could feel the sharp edges of anger creeping into her chest, but she pushed it down. Lily didn't need her anger right now. She needed reassurance. "You're safe here," Maggie whispered, her voice low and steady. "You're safe with me, Lily. Always." Lily's eyes fluttered shut, but Maggie saw the tears that gathered at the corners threatening to fall. She wanted to brush them away, to promise that everything would be okay. But she knew those words were empty without action. Maggie kissed her granddaughter's forehead, lingering for a moment longer than usual. She rose from the bed and turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in soft moonlight. As she closed the door behind her, she heard Lily's quiet sobs, a sound so soft but filled with so much pain. Maggie stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe. She would protect Lily. She didn't know how yet, but she would make sure that this child, her only family, never felt this way again. She would make sure that someone saw her pain, someone who would fight for her. And Maggie had already made up her mind. She would be that someone. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon, warm and inviting against the chilly Seattle morning. Maggie pulled open the door, the bell above it ringing softly as she stepped inside. Janet's place was always a haven. Dim lighting, old wooden tables, and mismatched chairs, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Janet was behind the counter, as usual, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked up when Maggie walked in, her sharp eyes softening as she saw the weight on her friend's face. Without a word, Janet waved Maggie over to a corner booth, already pulling out a menu and a steaming mug of coffee for her. "Rough morning?" Janet asked, her voice thick with unspoken understanding. Maggie sank into the booth, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the past few days. She had been holding it together, barely, but now that she was here, she couldn't keep up the pretense. She pushed her hands into her lap, fidgeting with her coat sleeves. "It's Lily," Maggie began, her voice tight. She begged me not to send her home, Janet." She let out a shaky breath, trying to keep the tears at bay. "She's terrified, and I don't know what to do. Paul and Heather, they're breaking her." Janet didn't flinch, just leaned forward, her eyes steady, sharp. "You can't let them do that. You can't just stand by and watch. That girl needs you." Maggie nodded, swallowing hard. The pain of hearing it out loud made her chest feel tight, like she couldn't breathe. "I don't know what I can do, though. I'm just her grandmother. They won't listen to me." Janet's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You're not just her grandmother. You're her safe place, Maggie. That counts for something. You have to protect her." Maggie closed her eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had always been the one to fix things. had always thought of herself as someone strong enough to handle anything. But this was different. Before Maggie could respond, the door opened with a creak, and a tall man in a suit entered the cafe. He had the kind of walk that came from years of being in control, and his graying hair and sharp suit screamed, "Lawyer." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Janet stood up, waving him over. "Richard, over here." Maggie looked up, surprised. "Richard?" Richard Hale was an old friend of Maggie's, her attorney, but also someone who'd been by her side through thick and thin. He slid into the booth across from her, offering a curt nod. Maggie noticed the lines in his face, the slight weariness in his eyes. He was always so measured, so calm. "Tell me what's going on," Richard said, his voice quiet but commanding. He pulled a notepad out of his briefcase, ready to take notes. Maggie hesitated. "It's Lily. Heather and Paul. Things are bad. Really bad. I don't think they're taking care of her, Richard. She's—" Maggie faltered, not knowing where to begin. "Neglect?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. Maggie nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "She begged me not to send her back. She said they don't talk to her. They just fight. Heather's... She doesn't even look at her. And Paul's always gone. It's breaking her down, Richard. I'm terrified for her." Richard was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if taking it all in. Then, slowly, he looked back at Maggie, his expression unreadable. "Document everything, Maggie," he said, his voice even but firm. "Record her words. Take pictures if you can. Every scrap of evidence you can gather will be crucial. You may need leverage." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "Leverage? You think... I think I can do something?" Richard didn't answer immediately, letting the question hang in the air. Then he added, "It's not just about what you think you can do, Maggie. It's about what you have to do. For Lily. And the court? They'll need something concrete if you want to stand a chance." The words sank in like stones, one after the other, the heaviness of them threatening to drown her. Maggie stared down at the table, her fingers gripping the edge of her coffee cup, still warm from Janet's touch. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. The resolve that had begun to form in her heart was now mixing with something else, something darker, something urgent. She thought about Lily's pleading eyes at the airport, the tremble in her voice. "She needs me," Maggie thought. "She needs me to do whatever it takes." Maggie let out a long breath, her gaze lifting to meet Richard's steady eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice cracking, vulnerable for the first time in days. "What if I can't protect her? What if I can't stop this?" Richard gave her a steady look, as if weighing her words. Then he nodded slowly. "You can, Maggie, and I'll help you. But you've got to be strong. For her." The words echoed in her mind, louder than she wanted them to be. Be strong. But as Maggie sat there, something shifted in her, a spark igniting in the depths of her chest. She hadn't realized just how much she was willing to sacrifice until now. The fight had just begun. And Maggie Collins wasn't about to back down. The days after Richard's visit felt like a blur of cold coffee and restless nights. Maggie had spent hours each day sifting through old boxes and drawers, searching for anything that might help her build a case for Lily. It was strange, almost surreal, how her whole life had become reduced to this, gathering proof, documenting pain, trying to find a way to make it stop. The small desk in her living room had become a war room, piles of photos, text messages, and emails scattered across it in a chaotic order. Old family pictures mixed with the recent ones of Lily, her smile always bright, always real, except for now, when that smile had dimmed and the shadows behind her eyes were unmistakable. Maggie's fingers trembled as she flipped through the photos, pausing on one where Lily was no more than 7, sitting on the front step of their old house, her face beaming with innocence. Maggie's heart twisted at the contrast of what Lily had been and what she had become. Maggie placed the photo down gently and picked up her phone. The messages from Heather were chilling in their coldness, a string of dismissive, quick exchanges. In one text from a few weeks ago, Heather had complained about the inconvenience of dealing with Lily's school issues. "She's just a teenager," the message read. "I don't have time for her drama." Maggie let out a shuddering breath, scrolling further. There were more messages, more signs of neglect, but they were buried beneath layers of Heather's excuses. Her throat tightened. What kind of mother, what kind of person, treated their child this way? Richard had been clear. "You need evidence, Maggie. Document everything." And that's what Maggie had done. She dug through the old texts, capturing everything in a new folder. Every painful exchange, every snap of Heather's indifference, every hint of Paul's absence. She moved to emails next, ones from Lily's teachers, notes about missed assignments, signs of emotional withdrawal. She even found one email from a concerned teacher who'd noticed how little Lily was eating at school. Maggie's hands shook as she pulled up the one from the school counselor. "Lily appears to be under a lot of stress," it said. "She's a bright student, but lately her grades have dropped, and she seems distracted in class." The email was dated a month ago. Maggie stared at it for a long time, wondering just how many times Lily had been let down by the people who were supposed to care for her the most. With each document she found, her resolve grew stronger. She knew it was all adding up, each piece of evidence, no matter how small. She was building something real. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked down to see a message from Janet. "I'll be by later today to help. You're not alone in this." Maggie's heart swelled with gratitude. Janet had been by her side through everything, always offering unwavering support. But she wasn't the only one standing with Maggie. As she worked, she could feel something shift within her. Something had changed. The doubts that had once clouded her mind were starting to fade, replaced by a fierce determination. She would fight for Lily. She would win. That evening, after hours of work, Maggie sat down at her desk, the clutter of evidence around her, and sent Richard an email with everything she had gathered. Her hands were steady now, the trembling gone. She no longer felt uncertain, no longer felt weak. This was no longer just about a grandmother trying to help. This was a fight for her granddaughter's future. She leaned back in her chair, looking over the binder Richard had promised to prepare, all of the printed evidence carefully organized. It was something real, something tangible. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was Lily's lifeline. Maggie smiled to herself, exhausted but determined. There was power in this. There was a real chance to change things. The next morning, Maggie found herself sitting at the kitchen table with Lily, the two of them eating pancakes together in the quiet morning light. Lily was quieter than usual, but Maggie could sense a change, a flicker of hope buried beneath the exhaustion in her granddaughter's eyes. "You doing okay?" Maggie asked, her voice gentle. Lily nodded, but there was a shadow in her gaze that Maggie couldn't ignore. She knew the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a while, she felt like she had the strength to fight back. And for Lily's sake, she would fight until the very end. Suddenly, the front door slammed open and Maggie's head snapped up, a chill running down her spine. It was Heather, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she stormed into the kitchen. Her eyes were hard, and Maggie could already feel the tension in the air. "What's all this?" Heather snapped, eyeing the papers spread out on the table. "What are you doing, Maggie?" Maggie's stomach clenched, her heart racing, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, meeting Heather's cold stare with a quiet strength she hadn't known she had. "I'm protecting Lily," Maggie said, her voice steady, unwavering, "and I won't let you break her anymore." The words hung in the air, thick with defiance. Heather's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into a sneer. "You think you can just take her away from me? You don't know what you're dealing with, Maggie." Maggie stood her ground. "You're wrong. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I'm not backing down." Heather's fury bubbled to the surface, but Maggie could see the uncertainty lurking behind it. For the first time in a long while, Maggie didn't feel small. She felt powerful. The fight had begun. And Maggie Collins wasn't about to let anyone take her granddaughter from her again. The air was thick with tension in the Collins house. It had been 2 days since Maggie had stood her ground against Heather. Since then, everything had been quieter. Too quiet. Heather's usual tirade of passive-aggressive comments had shifted to cold, simmering silence, as if the threat Maggie had made hung over them like a storm cloud. Paul was still away on business, leaving the house in an unnatural stillness that somehow only deepened the weight of everything Lily had said. But this morning, Maggie could sense something was different. Lily had been unusually distant all morning, retreating into her room after a quick breakfast. Maggie could see the shadows lingering in Lily's eyes, the way she held herself, like the walls around her were getting too high to climb. Maggie's heart sank, but she didn't push. She knew Lily would come to her when she was ready, and when the knock on her door came, it wasn't unexpected. Janet had arrived earlier, a quiet, steady presence, who always knew when Maggie needed her. "Everything okay?" Janet asked, settling into the armchair by the window, the soft click of her coffee mug setting the tone of calm that Maggie desperately needed. "I don't know," Maggie said, her voice shaking slightly. "I feel like Lily's holding something in. I don't know how much more of this she can take. She's breaking." Janet didn't answer, but her gaze softened, a silent understanding passing between them. Maggie stood up, her fingers running nervously over the stack of papers on her kitchen table. She was getting closer. She could feel it in her bones, the way the evidence was stacking up. But something told her that even the paperwork wouldn't be enough to prepare her for what Lily was about to reveal. The doorbell rang, and Maggie's stomach dropped. She opened the door to find Heather, who was already halfway down the driveway. Maggie watched, feeling her chest tighten. Heather didn't even look back when she called over her shoulder. "I'll be gone for a few hours. Lily's in her room." The door slammed shut, leaving the house empty once again. Maggie's feet moved before she'd even decided to, her body pulling her toward Lily's room as if it were the only place that mattered. When she knocked gently, Lily's voice came through, soft and shaky. "Come in." Maggie opened the door to find Lily curled up in the corner of her bed, her knees pulled to her chest, hugging them tightly. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, as if Lily were hiding from the world itself. Maggie sat down beside her, the weight of the silence heavy between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lily's voice broke through the quiet, barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go back, Grandma." Maggie's heart cracked, but she fought to keep her voice steady. "You don't have to, honey. You're safe here. I'll always keep you safe." Lily's lip trembled. They leave me all the time. I'm alone at night. Heather goes out, and sometimes Paul doesn't even come home. It's just so quiet, and I don't know what to do." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, heart pounding. She had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from Lily, hearing the truth in those broken words, was a different kind of pain. Maggie's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Can I record what you're saying, sweetheart? So I can show someone who can help?" Lily nodded, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Maggie hit the record button, her hands shaking as she held the phone. "Take your time, Lily," Maggie said softly, Tell me everything. Lily swallowed hard, her voice thick with emotion. Some nights, I stay in my room until I fall asleep. I hear them, arguing downstairs. And then I just cry. I try to clean up after myself, but it's hard. Sometimes I don't even know if I'm doing the right thing. It's too much, Grandma. The sound of Lily's confession hung in the air, fragile and raw. Maggie's heart twisted as she listened, but she didn't stop recording. This was the truth. This was the reason she had to fight, no matter what. Lily paused, her voice cracking. Grandma, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Maggie wiped her own eyes, blinking away the tears she hadn't realized were there. She reached over and gently took Lily's hand, her voice soft, but filled with the strength she didn't know she had. You don't have to be scared anymore, sweetheart. I'm here, and I won't let them hurt you. She hugged Lily tightly, feeling the fragile girl in her arms, the weight of the world too heavy on her shoulders. But Maggie knew. She knew it wasn't just Lily who needed protection. It was time for Maggie to take the final step. She stood up, pulling Lily with her. I'm going to make sure this stops. We'll go to court if we have to. You'll never be alone again, Lily. I promise you. Just then, Maggie's phone buzzed, the sudden sound slicing through the tension. It was a message from Richard, the words appearing on the screen like a shockwave through her chest. Maggie, you need to know something. Paul knew about everything, and he did nothing. Maggie's hand froze, the phone slipping from her fingers. The world seemed to pause as she absorbed the message. Paul had known. He had known and done nothing. Maggie's pulse quickened, her breath shallow. Everything she had suspected, everything that had felt off about Paul's behavior, it was true. And now, the fight was bigger than ever. Maggie sat in her kitchen, the phone pressed against her ear, her fingers tightening around the ceramic mug in front of her. The hum of the refrigerator in the quiet house was the only other sound, a stark contrast to the chaos of her thoughts. Paul's voice came through the line, smooth, distant, and as cold as ever. Yeah, Mom, I know, he said, his tone clipped, like he was already tired of the conversation before it had even begun. I'll be home in a couple of days. Heather's just dramatic. Don't worry about it. Maggie's grip on the mug tightened. She could feel the heat of the coffee seeping into her palm, but it did nothing to calm the fire that had begun to simmer in her chest. Dramatic? That was how he would dismiss it? He had heard his daughter's desperate plea at the airport, heard the pain in her voice. And this was his response? Maggie, I'm in the middle of something, Paul continued, his irritation growing. I'll talk to Heather when I get home. Just don't make a big deal out of it, okay? A big deal? Maggie's voice rose, but she quickly pushed it back down, her throat tightening with a cocktail of rage and heartbreak. Paul, she begged me in tears. She's scared. She doesn't want to go back there. There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. Maggie could almost hear him tapping his pen against the desk in his hotel room, his usual dismissive habit so painfully familiar. Finally, he spoke again, his voice flat. Look, you know how Heather is. She's probably just stressed, that's all. Lily's fine. You're overreacting. Maggie's jaw clenched, her nails digging into the ceramic. She wanted to scream at him, tell him how wrong he was, how everything was falling apart at home. She wanted to say it all. The endless nights Lily spent alone. The shouting matches between him and Heather. The coldness that wrapped itself around their house like a fog. But Maggie knew that it wouldn't matter. Paul wasn't hearing her. He wasn't listening. Lily is not fine, Paul. Maggie's voice cracked, but she didn't care. She's not fine. She's falling apart, and you're too busy with your work to even see it. There was a long pause, and then Paul's voice, cooler now, more dismissive than ever. Mom, I don't have time for this. I'm working. We'll talk about it when I get home, but you need to stop getting so worked up. It's just a phase, okay? Maggie's breath quickened, and the anger inside her began to surge. She had given him so many chances to step up, to be a father to Lily, and every time he had failed. Now he was sweeping it all under the rug, acting as though his daughter's pain was nothing more than a nuisance. Fine, Maggie spat, her voice cold as ice. But don't expect me to sit quietly while you continue to ignore what's happening. I'll handle it myself. There was another pause on the other end of the line before Paul spoke again, his voice almost patronizing. I don't know why you're making this such a big deal. I'll see you when I get back, Mom. The line went dead, and Maggie dropped the phone on the table, the weight of the silence almost unbearable. Her hands shook, her chest tight, but her eyes burned with something else. Something darker, something she couldn't quite name, but that she knew she would carry with her every step of the way. Her gaze turned toward the hallway, toward the closed door of Lily's room, and then she heard it. The softest sob. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air like a knife. Maggie's heart broke, but it also hardened. She stood up, moving quickly, almost mechanically, toward the sound. She opened the door to find Lily sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling with each stifled cry. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but the light from the hallway filtered in just enough to illuminate the despair in Lily's face. Maggie stepped forward, crouching down in front of her granddaughter. Lily, she whispered, her voice gentle but firm. Look at me, honey. Lily lifted her face, her eyes swollen and red from crying. The sight of it made Maggie's heart ache, but there was something more, a fierce protectiveness, a promise. No one would ever do this to Lily again. I tried to tell him, Grandma. Lily stammered through her tears. I told him how I feel, but he didn't care. He never cares. He doesn't love me. None of them do. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, cupping Lily's face in her hands, forcing the girl to look at her. You listen to me, Lily, she said softly, but with unwavering certainty. You are loved. You are so loved. And I'm never going to let them do this to you again. Do you hear me? Lily nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Maggie pulled her into a tight hug, holding her with everything she had. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than anger and fear. Love. Love for her granddaughter, love for the strength she saw in her, even in the face of everything that had happened. But as they pulled away, Maggie's resolve solidified. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after what Paul had said, not after what Lily had been through. As she gently kissed Lily's forehead, she whispered, You'll never be alone again. I'll make sure of it. But as Maggie stood up, her thoughts turned dark. Paul had known. He had known what Heather was doing, what he had allowed to happen to his own daughter. And in that moment, Maggie understood. The battle wasn't just against Heather. It was against Paul too. Her blood ran cold as she thought of the future. She would protect Lily no matter what it took, even if it meant going up against her own son. And this time, Maggie Collins wasn't going to lose. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she watched the soft glow of the morning sun slip through the curtains. The quiet in the house was almost suffocating, but there was a sense of calm, of purpose, that had settled in her chest after the storm of the past few days. She had spent the night going over the evidence once again, the weight of her resolve growing with every page, every word that painted the truth of what Lily had endured. But that calm was shattered when her phone buzzed, an alert flashing on the screen. Maggie picked it up, expecting a message from Janet, maybe an update from Richard. But instead, it was a Facebook notification. Heather had posted a status update, one that immediately made Maggie's stomach churn. My dear mother-in-law is losing her mind. Now she thinks she can raise my child. Someone should tell her it's not 1960 anymore. Senile, get over it. Maggie felt the blood rush to her face, the words cutting deeper than she had anticipated. The mocking tone, the casual dismissal, it was so Heather. She had never cared about Lily, had never truly seen the damage she was causing. And now, as if to rub salt in the wound, she was belittling Maggie for stepping in, for trying to protect her granddaughter. Maggie set the phone down slowly, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the boiling anger that rose within her. Heather had underestimated her. She had no idea who she was dealing with. As Maggie stood up, the weight of the moment felt heavier than ever. The house was eerily silent, the calm before the storm. But the storm was coming, and Maggie knew exactly how she was going to face it. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, where Janet was waiting, a quiet force in the background, as she had been since this all began. Janet's expression darkened as Maggie showed her the post. "That's low, Maggie," Janet muttered, shaking her head. "She'll regret that." Maggie's lips tightened, a quiet fire flickering in her eyes. "She'll regret underestimating me." Janet gave a slow nod, pulling her phone from her bag. "I'll start circulating some screenshots of her hypocrisy. Let's see how that plays out." Maggie didn't answer, her mind already working. She had worked too hard to let Heather's lies smear her reputation. Too many hours spent gathering evidence, too many nights spent worrying over Lily's future. Heather could mock her all she wanted, but Maggie had something Heather didn't: truth. By the time Richard arrived later that afternoon, he already knew what had happened. The defamation suit he had been preparing for Maggie was now more relevant than ever. "We can't let this go unanswered," Richard said as he sat down across from her, flipping through a binder. The moment she went public, it became a different kind of fight. Maggie nodded, still feeling the sting of Heather's words, but with a deep sense of resolve settling over her. "I don't care what she says about me, but I will not let her ruin Lily's future." Richard paused, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "You're ready for this?" Maggie inhaled deeply, pushing aside the lingering anger. "I'm ready." Richard slid a draft of a response letter across the table, his pen poised for Maggie's approval. The letter would counter Heather's online slander, pointing out her hypocrisy, detailing the accusations, and demanding a retraction. It was a formal step in what was quickly becoming a battle not just for Lily's custody, but for her dignity, and for Maggie's own. "I'll have this out by tomorrow," Richard said, his voice steady. "And we'll begin preparing for court. She won't get away with this." Maggie exhaled, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "Thank you, Richard. I don't know what I'd do without you." Before Richard could answer, a soft knock came at the door. Maggie turned, her heart softening as Lily stepped into the room, her eyes still red from the tears she had shed earlier, but with a faint smile on her lips. "Grandma?" Lily asked quietly, her voice fragile but filled with quiet strength. Maggie opened her arms, pulling Lily into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." Lily hugged her back, burying her face in Maggie's shoulder. "Thank you for believing me," she whispered, "for not letting them make me feel crazy." Maggie held her tighter, her throat tight with emotion. This, right here, was the reason she fought. Not just for the documents, not just for the evidence, but for this girl who deserved a chance to be happy, to be loved, to feel safe. "You are not crazy, Lily," Maggie said softly, her voice firm. "You are so strong, and I will never stop fighting for you. I promise." As Lily pulled away, wiping her eyes, Maggie caught a glimpse of the girl she used to be, the bright, hopeful girl who had been buried under the weight of neglect. but she could see the flicker of something else in her now. Strength. Maggie stood, her hand resting on Lily's shoulder. "We'll get through this. You'll never be alone again." Lily nodded, a quiet resolve in her eyes. "I believe you." Maggie's heart swelled. She had everything she needed to fight this war. She had Lily's love, Janet's loyalty, and Richard's unwavering support. And she had the truth. That was something Heather couldn't take away, no matter how hard she tried. The phone buzzed again. Another notification from Facebook. This time, a message from one of the neighbors. Maggie's fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't need to look. She already knew what it said. This was just the beginning, and Maggie Collins was ready to face it head-on. As she turned toward the window, the afternoon sun flooding the room, Maggie knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down now. Not for anything. The courthouse loomed before Maggie, its stone facade as cold and unyielding as the battle she was about to face inside. The air felt thick, charged with tension, as she walked alongside Janet, each step heavy with anticipation. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was purposeful. Both women knew the stakes. They had seen enough to understand the gravity of what was about to unfold. As they entered the building, Richard was already there, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he prepared for the long day ahead. He nodded at Maggie and Janet, his presence reassuring despite the seriousness in his demeanor. Today, everything hinged on what would be said in that courtroom. Maggie glanced at the clock. The hearing was about to begin. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The courtroom was stark, its walls cold and echoing, as if the building itself held its breath. The judge's bench stood at the far end of the room, elevated and imposing, a silent reminder of the authority that would ultimately decide Lily's fate. A few chairs were scattered around the room, but the space was dominated by the long wooden table in the center, where the lawyers and parties would sit. Maggie and Janet sat together on one side, Richard beside them, the quiet hum of whispered conversations filling the air as people found their seats. Heather entered the room just as the doors were closing, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Paul was arm in arm with her, looking every bit the polished businessman he always tried to appear to be, his face a mask of indifference. But beneath it, Maggie could see the unease, the guilt simmering beneath the surface. He was never one for confrontation. Maggie's pulse quickened as she watched them take their seats, but she refused to look away. Heather smirked at her from across the room, an expression of disdain barely concealed. She didn't seem to care about what was happening here, not the gravity of the situation, not the harm she'd caused Lily. Maggie knew that Heather didn't truly see her, didn't understand the depths of what she was fighting for. The judge entered the room and everyone stood, the weight of the moment pressing in. The gavel came down with a sharp bang, and the proceedings began. "Let's begin with the petitioner," the judge said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Ms. Collins, you may proceed." Richard rose to his feet, smooth and confident as he addressed the judge, outlining the case for Maggie's guardianship over Lily. He spoke with clarity, his words precise as he presented the evidence, texts, photos, testimonies, all of it carefully laid out. Maggie sat silently, her heart pounding in her chest, as the weight of what they had uncovered was revealed for the first time. The neglect, the emotional abuse, the times Lily had been left alone, each detail, each piece of evidence, filled the room with undeniable truth. But it was Lily's turn to speak that would change everything. The judge turned his attention toward Lily, his eyes softening as he motioned for her to approach the stand. Maggie's heart ached as Lily stood, her legs trembling slightly. The young girl was doing this for herself, and Maggie couldn't be prouder. She had watched this shy, withdrawn child grow into someone with the courage to speak her truth. Lily's voice was soft at first, barely above a whisper, but as she spoke, it became stronger, more confident. "I don't feel safe at home," she said, her words trembling but clear. "I'm alone most of the time. I hear them fighting, and sometimes they don't even care if I'm there. I try to clean up, to make things better, but it's just not enough." She paused, her eyes flickering toward Maggie, who gave her a reassuring nod. "I want to live with my grandma. She she makes me feel safe." Maggie's throat tightened with emotion, but she forced herself to remain still, to let Lily's words resonate through the room. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. The judge listened intently, his gaze unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't show any signs of judgment, just let Lily speak, letting her words settle into the room. But not everyone was so patient. Heather's eyes were rolling, her lips pressed into a tight line as Lily's testimony went on. Maggie could see the disdain in Heather's face, the contempt for Lily's bravery, the refusal to acknowledge the pain she had caused. She shifted in her seat, her arms crossed tightly as if trying to block out the truth. Paul, too, was silent, his face unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides. When Lily finished, the room held its breath, the silence palpable. Maggie couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This was it. This was her chance to show that Lily had been wronged, to prove that the life she had lived with Heather and Paul had been filled with neglect, not love. The judge turned his attention to Heather, who immediately tried to shift the narrative, brushing her hand through her hair and speaking in a calm, dismissive tone. "Your Honor, this is just a phase. Lily's a teenager. She's dramatic. Like every teenager. We have our own way of raising her, but that's not something anyone else can understand." Her words dripped with a false sense of certainty, her attempts to downplay the truth too obvious. Heather was trying to paint herself as the victim here, trying to erase the years of hurt she had caused. But it was too late. The truth had already been spoken. Maggie's chest tightened, but she kept her gaze steady, watching as Heather continued to speak, her words becoming increasingly more defensive, more hollow. The judge interrupted her with a sharp, calm voice. "Ms. Collins, please refrain from interrupting the proceedings." Heather flushed with irritation, her smirk faltering for just a moment. But it was clear. She was losing control, and Maggie could feel it, a small but crucial victory in the midst of this battle. The hearing continued, the judge asking questions, his voice firm but impartial, as he sifted through the evidence. Maggie sat quietly, her heart still racing, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She wasn't backing down, but as the proceedings dragged on, she could sense the tide turning. The truth was undeniable. This wasn't just about custody. It was about a child's safety, her right to feel loved and cared for. And Maggie knew one thing for sure. Heather and Paul were losing this fight, and Lily was finally going to be free. The doorbell rang sharply, cutting through the stillness of the house. Maggie's heart leapt in her chest, and for a moment, she thought her anxiety was playing tricks on her. She had been expecting this, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of it, a home visit from the social workers. It had only been a few days since the hearing, but now, the court was taking the next step. They were coming to see the conditions Lily had been living in, to assess whether the life she'd had with Heather and Paul was truly as safe and stable as they claimed. Maggie stood up from her chair, heart hammering, her eyes flickering toward the door. "Grandma," Lily's voice cracked from behind her. And Maggie turned to see the girl standing at the edge of the kitchen, her eyes wide, filled with worry. "It's okay, sweetie," Maggie said, trying to sound calm, even though she felt anything but. "They're just here to check everything out. You're safe." But Lily shook her head, a faint tremble in her chin. "I don't want them to see. I don't want them to think I'm..." Broken. Maggie crossed the room quickly, pulling Lily into a tight hug. You're not broken, sweetheart. You're strong. You've been through a lot, and you've handled it better than anyone I know. This is just one step closer to making sure you're safe. Always. Lily clung to her, her small body shaking, and Maggie felt the weight of it. This was the moment. This was where they would either validate Lily's fears or prove them to be just another manipulation by Heather. But Maggie knew one thing for sure. She was not going to let Lily down now. With a final squeeze, Maggie pulled away and led Lily to the door. When she opened it, the social worker stepped inside, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. Behind her was a man in his early 30s, clipboard in hand, who followed her in silently. "Ms. Collins?" the social worker asked, her voice steady but kind. "We're here to conduct an unannounced visit. Is now a good time?" Maggie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Of course. Please, come in." The social workers stepped into the house and Maggie watched them carefully, her mind racing as they glanced around the living room, as if they were evaluating every detail of the space. They weren't here to judge the house's cleanliness. She knew that much. They were looking for the cracks in the facade, the signs of neglect that had plagued Lily's life for so long. The caseworker began asking routine questions, things Maggie had prepared herself to answer with clarity and honesty. But it wasn't until they moved to the kitchen that things took a turn. The fridge door opened with a soft squeak, and the caseworker paused, her eyes scanning the shelves. The fridge was nearly empty, save for a few items in the back. An almost empty bottle of milk, a half-wilted bunch of lettuce, and some cans of soup that looked like they'd been there far too long. Maggie felt a pang in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't about her. This was about Lily's safety. The caseworker shut the fridge with a soft click, her gaze moving over the countertops next, where unpaid bills were piled up in disarray. A pile of unopened envelopes marked with overdue notices and warnings. Maggie saw the way the social worker's eyes lingered on the papers, her gaze sharp, calculating. Then the noise started. From upstairs, there came the unmistakable sound of shouting, a familiar, angry exchange. It wasn't just the usual raised voices, though. It was intense, frantic, full of the rawness of frustration and bitterness. Maggie's stomach tightened as she recognized Heather's voice, followed by Paul's colder, more measured tones. The social worker exchanged a glance with her colleague, who moved toward the stairs, taking note of the argument. Maggie stayed frozen, her mind scrambling, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt gnawing at her. It wasn't her fight. It wasn't her choice. She had done everything she could to provide a safe place for Lily, but it was out of her hands now. She could only hope that the social workers had heard enough to understand the weight of the situation. As the arguing grew louder, Maggie's heart hammered. This wasn't just a visit. This was the moment that would determine everything. When the social workers returned to the kitchen, the caseworker's expression had shifted, her eyes hardening as she turned to Maggie. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. Maggie opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Heather appeared at the top of the stairs. Her face was flushed with anger, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She glared at the social workers, her eyes narrowed with an unmistakable disdain. "What are you doing here?" Heather's voice was sharp, her words dripping with venom. "You're just here to tear apart my family, aren't you?" Maggie could feel the tension in the room as Heather approached, but she remained silent, watching with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about Heather's frustration. This was about Lily. The social worker turned toward Heather, her voice calm but unwavering. "We're here to assess the living conditions of Lily Collins. As you know, there have been concerns raised about her safety. If you're not willing to cooperate, we'll have to take this further." Heather's face turned an angry shade of red, her hands clenching into fists. This is all Maggie's fault. She's the one stirring things up. She's lying about everything. Paul appeared behind Heather, his eyes narrowed in frustration. He sighed heavily, his posture stiff. I didn't know anything about it. I'm just trying to get through this business trip. You know how things are. The caseworker noted it all carefully, her pen moving across the clipboard, recording every moment, every exchange. Maggie stood her ground, watching Lily cling to her side, refusing to leave. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the truth began to unfold in front of everyone. Lily, the caseworker finally said, her voice soft, could you please come over here and sit with us for a moment? Lily hesitated for a long moment, but then, without a word, she took Maggie's hand and walked toward the caseworker. She sat down beside her, her eyes full of quiet determination. The caseworker glanced over at Maggie, a look of sympathy crossing her face. We'll have a report ready soon, Ms. Collins. Please make sure Lily is comfortable. Maggie nodded, her heart thundering in her chest as she looked down at Lily, who clung to her side, her eyes wide with anxiety. A few moments later, the caseworker returned with a single sheet of paper. She handed it to Maggie with a quiet but weighty finality. The paper was official, typed, neatly formatted. It read, "Temporary custody is granted to Maggie Collins, effective immediately." The room spun for a moment as Maggie absorbed the words, the reality of what had just happened. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory. Lily was finally safe, for now. The first night Lily spent in Maggie's home was quiet, a soft hum of calm that settled over them like a blanket. The house, though small and modest, felt warmer than it ever had before. The rooms, once so familiar and cold, now carried a sense of purpose. This was no longer a refuge just for Maggie. It was now a sanctuary for Lily, a place where she could grow, heal, and breathe without fear. Lily's suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, half unpacked, her clothes folded neatly on the dresser. But the thing that made the room truly hers was the soft glow of the nightlight, the little touches Maggie had added. Things she hoped would make the space feel welcoming, even if only a little at first. A stuffed animal Maggie had bought her that afternoon, a new set of colorful sheets, a small vase of wildflowers by the window. Maggie had stayed up late, putting together a simple dinner of chicken, roasted vegetables, and mashed potatoes. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comforting. As she set the table, the familiar smell filled the kitchen, calming her nerves. The house had been empty for too long, the quiet oppressive. But now, with Lily here, the silence didn't feel so heavy. Lily had been hesitant at first, picking at her food as if she wasn't sure it was okay to enjoy it, unsure if she could let herself feel comfortable. Maggie watched her closely, her heart aching for the girl who had been so starved for affection, for care. But by the time they finished, the atmosphere had softened. Lily's laughter was tentative at first, but soon it filled the kitchen, light and bright. And that sound, that sweet sound, was everything Maggie needed to hear. She knew it would take time, but she also knew that Lily was starting to trust her again. Over the next few days, Lily settled in. She kept to herself for a while, but gradually began to unpack her life into the small space. Maggie watched her, letting her take the lead when she was ready. Every night they sat at the table together, eating warm meals. Janet stopped by often, bringing homemade muffins or fresh fruit. Sitting with Lily at the table and making her laugh. They talked about everything and nothing. School, books, and the latest shows Lily had started watching. Lily's grades, once in freefall, started to improve. She came home from school one afternoon, a bright grin on her face, holding up a test paper. A 92. Maggie's heart swelled as she looked at it, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She wanted to tell Lily how proud she was, how hard she'd worked, but instead, she just pulled her into a hug, the words too overwhelming to speak. But the peace they'd found was short-lived. A few days later, Maggie sat at the kitchen table sipping her coffee when her phone buzzed. A Facebook notification. She glanced at it, and the color drained from her face. Heather had posted again. Some people think they can just take a child from her real parents. Let's see how this grandma thing plays out in court. Cheer kidnapping youth, wake up. Maggie's stomach turned, but she kept her breathing steady. She knew Heather would do this. She would twist the narrative, play the victim, claim that Lily had been taken from her against her will. Maggie had prepared herself for this. For the lies, the social media posts, meant to sway public opinion. But still, seeing it laid out in front of her made it sting. Lily came into the room just then, and Maggie quickly hid her phone, not wanting her to see it. But Lily's eyes were sharp, and she noticed. "Is it about Heather?" she asked softly. Maggie hesitated, her fingers clenched around the phone. She didn't want to make this harder for Lily, but she couldn't lie to her. "Yes, sweetie. She's upset." Lily looked down, her expression faltering, but Maggie could see the strength beneath it. "I don't care what she says," Lily muttered. "I'm glad I'm here. With you." Maggie smiled gently, her heart full. "And I'm glad you're here too." But Maggie knew that this was just the beginning. Heather wasn't going to let go easily. She'd fight, lash out, try to make everyone believe that Maggie was the one in the wrong. Later that day, Maggie sat down at the table with Richard's response letter in hand. She was ready to fight. She had no other choice. It was clear now that Heather wouldn't stop until she had torn apart everything Maggie had worked for. Everything Maggie had built for Lily. But Maggie wasn't backing down. Not now. She was snapped from her thoughts as her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Paul. She stared at the screen for a moment, considering whether to answer. When she did, his voice was cold, distant. "Maggie," Paul began, his voice tinged with irritation. "I've seen Heather's post. What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Maggie's jaw tightened, her grip tightening around the phone. She had expected this, but it didn't make it easier. "Paul, you've done nothing to protect Lily. You've let her suffer, and I'm done letting you pretend like nothing's wrong. She's with me now, and you'll just have to accept that." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Maggie thought he might say something, anything to make it right. But instead, he sighed deeply, the sound of frustration and shame filling the line. "I don't know what to do, Maggie. I don't. But this isn't the way to fix it. This isn't what's best for Lily." Maggie's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You don't get to tell me what's best for her, Paul. Not anymore." With that, the call ended. And as the phone slipped from her hand, Maggie looked up to see Lily standing at the door of the kitchen, her face a mix of sadness and relief. "He's not coming, is he?" Lily asked quietly, her voice small but filled with understanding. Maggie shook her head. "No, sweetie, he's not." Lily's shoulders sagged for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down on her. But then, she straightened, and for the first time in days, a small smile crept onto her face. "We're okay, right?" she asked. Maggie pulled her close, holding her tightly. "We're more than okay. You're safe here, Lily, and that's all that matters." For now, Maggie knew that was all that mattered. The courtroom was a battleground, and today was the final round. Maggie could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, from the judge who scrutinized every word, to the opposing attorneys, and, most notably, to Lily, who sat at her side, her hand tucked firmly in Maggie's. Lily's grip was the only thing holding Maggie steady, the only thing that made her believe she was doing the right thing, no matter how much it felt like the world was caving in on them. Richard stood at the front, his voice steady and unwavering as he called the first witnesses. He had prepared meticulously for this moment, and it was finally paying off. He had gathered evidence, testimonies, and documents that painted a clear picture of neglect and mistreatment. And now, it was time for the truth to come to light. "Your Honor," Richard began, his eyes scanning the room, "I call Lily's teachers to testify regarding her recent progress. The first teacher, Mrs. Hamilton, a kind woman with silver glasses perched on the edge of her nose, took the stand. She was clearly nervous but determined. Her testimony was the lifeline Maggie had hoped for, and Mrs. Hamilton didn't disappoint. "She's a completely different student now," Mrs. Hamilton said, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. Before, Lily was withdrawn, often late with assignments, and her grades were dropping. But since she moved in with her grandmother, she's become more engaged, more focused. Her grades have improved dramatically. She's eager to participate in class and even helps other students with their work. I've never seen a child thrive so quickly under such circumstances." Maggie's heart swelled with pride, and she caught a glimpse of Lily looking at Mrs. Hamilton, her eyes wide with something between awe and relief. Maggie squeezed her hand, giving her an unspoken promise. "You'll never have to go through this alone again." The next witness was a neighbor, Mrs. Diaz, who had been one of the first to notice the cracks in Heather's parenting. She hesitated at first, but then spoke with the same quiet resolve that Maggie had admired in others. "I've lived next door to the Collins family for over 5 years," Mrs. Diaz began, her voice soft but firm. "Lily was often alone, sometimes for hours. I saw Heather leave the house many times, always in a hurry, never checking on Lily. It wasn't right. I tried to talk to her about it, but she brushed me off. I'd bring over food or just knock to make sure Lily was okay. It wasn't enough. I could see the way Lily was struggling. It was like she was invisible to them." Maggie's throat tightened as she listened. Every word Mrs. Diaz spoke confirmed everything Maggie had feared. It was hard to hear, but it was necessary. They had to expose the truth. As the afternoon dragged on, the courtroom became a heavy, suffocating place. Maggie could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but the thought of Lily sitting beside her, clutching her hand, kept her from faltering. The next witness was Janet, and Maggie knew her friend would testify with every ounce of passion in her. Janet was a fighter, and she was going to fight for Lily too. Janet walked confidently to the stand, her voice loud and clear as she addressed the court. "I've known Maggie for over 30 years, she said, her eyes never leaving the judge. "I've watched her raise her children, seen her go through tough times, and never once has she faltered when it came to her family. I've seen the way Lily has changed since moving in with Maggie. It's like night and day. She's no longer the quiet, scared little girl I once saw. She's blossomed into someone who feels safe and loved. Maggie has given her a real home, where she's not just surviving, but thriving." Janet's words hit home, echoing in the silent room. Maggie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, her focus unwavering. Janet was right. This was Lily's chance. This was her future. Heather's turn came next, and Maggie could sense the tension in the room shifting. Heather had been quiet for most of the day, her arms crossed tightly, her face drawn in a mask of thinly veiled contempt. But now, as she took the stand, her posture stiffened. Her words came out in a controlled, defensive manner. "She's making this all up," Heather began, her voice dripping with disdain. "Lily is just being difficult. She's a teenager. She wants to be with her grandmother because she thinks it's easier. Maggie has been playing on her emotions, filling her head with lies." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. Heather was doing exactly what Maggie had expected, minimizing everything, denying the obvious. But this time, Heather's defenses didn't hold the same power. The truth was already out, and Heather's lies only made her look more desperate. The cross-examination was sharp, Richard was relentless. "Ms. Collins, you've been aware of your daughter's emotional struggles, correct?" he asked. "Yet, you did nothing to help her. You left her home alone, ignored her needs, and now you accuse her of lying to avoid responsibility? Can you explain that?" Heather's eyes narrowed, but her composure began to crack. "I've done what I thought was best for her," she snapped, her voice rising. "You don't know what it's like to deal with her." "Don't I?" Richard shot back, his voice biting. "You never bothered to know your daughter. That's the problem, isn't it?" Heather flushed, her lips quivering with frustration. The cracks in her facade were becoming too obvious to ignore. And then, Maggie saw it. Paul, sitting across from her, his gaze shifting uneasily. For the first time in the proceedings, his eyes met Maggie's, and for just a moment he looked ashamed. His mouth tightened, and he shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the truth that was being revealed. Maggie could see it now. He wasn't just avoiding confrontation. He was uncomfortable with what was coming to light. But it was too late. Lily's hand tightened in Maggie's as she watched it all unfold. The truth, piece by piece, eroding the walls Heather and Paul had built around their lies. The people who were supposed to protect her had failed. But here, in this courtroom, Lily had the chance to be heard. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie allowed herself to feel the smallest flicker of hope. The courtroom was still, every breath in the room suspended in anticipation. Maggie sat at the table, her fingers trembling slightly, though she gripped Lily's hand with steady resolve. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the finality of it all hanging in the air. The judge was reading through the evidence, his face unreadable, his brow furrowed as he considered the case one last time. Maggie's heart raced in her chest as she watched him. This was it. The decision that would change everything for Lily. She could see the exhaustion in Lily's eyes, the quiet hope that she wouldn't have to go back to that place, her old life, that place where no one had cared enough to protect her. The judge, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a stern demeanor, finally looked up from his notes. He took a deep breath, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the testimony from Lily's teachers, neighbors, and other witnesses, it is clear that this child has suffered significant neglect, both emotional and physical. Her safety and well-being were never properly ensured in her biological home. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, the words landing with a heavy, irreversible finality. She could hear Lily's breath beside her, shallow and quick, as though she were bracing herself for what came next. The conditions that Lily Collins was subjected to cannot be ignored, the judge continued, his voice steady. Despite the attempts made by Ms. Simone Collins to minimize the situation, the evidence shows a pattern of neglect and emotional abuse. These are not isolated incidents, and they have had a lasting impact on Lily's well-being. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, focusing on the judge, on Lily, on the moment she had been fighting for. The court finds in favor of Maggie Collins. I hereby grant her permanent guardianship of Lily Collins. The child's best interests are clearly served in this environment. Maggie's heart exploded in her chest, relief flooding through her, and she squeezed Lily's hand tighter, the reality of it settling in like the first breath after being underwater. It wasn't just temporary custody anymore. It was permanent. It was theirs. Across the room, Heather let out a sharp, strangled cry, the sound loud and raw as it echoed through the courtroom. Maggie turned to see Heather, her face contorted in rage and disbelief, her hands flailing as she stood up, knocking over her chair in a chaotic display of fury. "No, this isn't right. This is my daughter. You can't just take her from me," Heather screamed, her voice shrill and broken. Her face was flushed with anger, and Maggie could see the madness in her eyes. The truth had finally pierced her carefully constructed walls, and now she was unraveling before everyone. Maggie didn't flinch. She had fought for this moment. She had fought for Lily's future. Paul sat beside Heather, his face pale, his hands gripping the sides of his chair as if trying to hold himself together. He looked defeated, his eyes downcast. He didn't meet Maggie's gaze, and for the first time, Maggie didn't feel the need to look at him with anything but pity. The man who had once been her son was now just a shadow of the person he could have been, a man too weak to stand up for his own child. The courtroom erupted into a momentary chaos, voices rising as Heather's cries became more desperate, but Maggie's focus never wavered. She couldn't hear the noise anymore. All she could hear was Lily's breath beside her, the soft sound of her child, her real child, finally safe. Lily turned to Maggie, her face trembling as tears filled her eyes. Maggie felt her own tears well up, but she didn't let them fall just yet. She pulled Lily close, wrapping her in a tight, protective embrace, their hearts beating in unison. Lily's voice was soft, but filled with a raw, aching relief. "Grandma, I don't have to go back, do I?" Maggie shook her head, the words finally breaking free. "No, sweetheart, you're not going anywhere. You're here, with me, forever." Lily's sobs came then, soft and hesitant at first, but soon they grew louder, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Maggie held her, gently rocking her back and forth, whispering words of comfort, of safety. Around them, the courtroom began to settle. The judge gave one final, firm order for the courtroom to be cleared. But none of that mattered to Maggie. What mattered was the child in her arms, the child who had been through so much, who now had a future in her hands. Through the tears, Maggie looked over at Heather. Still standing at the edge of the room, her hands clenched, her face contorted in disbelief. She was still trying to gather the pieces of the life she thought she could control. But Maggie knew it was over. Heather had lost, and Maggie had won. The fight wasn't over. There would still be battles to face. But today, for the first time in a long time, Maggie allowed herself to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Peace. For the first time, Maggie knew Lily was truly safe, and that was all that mattered. Months passed, and the house felt different, brighter, more alive, every corner infused with laughter and warmth. Lily had transformed. She was a different person from the withdrawn girl Maggie had once held close in the cold silence of her own pain. Now, Lily was full of life. She played with the dog in the yard, joined Maggie on walks to the park, and most of all, she smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. Maggie had watched this transformation with both awe and relief. Lily was no longer the child who flinched at raised voices, the one who pulled herself into corners to escape from the noise of a world that had never truly seen her. Now, Lily answered the phone when Janet called, excitedly sharing her latest project or her school grades. And she laughed without hesitation when they played silly games at the dinner table. Her grades continued to improve, her teachers praising her newfound confidence. There was a noticeable shift in the way she held herself, how she interacted with her peers, how she began to believe in the possibility of a future, one filled with opportunities she'd never dared to imagine before. One afternoon, Maggie was in the kitchen, preparing one of their usual dinners when Lily came rushing in, her face glowing with excitement. "Grandma, look what I made for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes wide with joy. In her hands, she held a simple handmade card, the words scrawled in crayon. It read, "Thank you, Grandma, for giving me a home and for loving me." Maggie felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she smiled through them. She reached out, taking the card carefully in her hands. It was simple, but it was everything. "Thank you, sweetheart," Maggie whispered, pulling Lily into a tight hug. "I love you so much." Lily hugged her back fiercely. I love you too. Meanwhile, outside the warm, protective cocoon of Maggie's home, Heather's world was crumbling. The fallout from the court case had spiraled far beyond her control. She was no longer the image-obsessed socialite, the woman who had curated a perfect life on the surface. The lies she had spun about Maggie and Lily had backfired, turning into a social media nightmare. Her once pristine image was shattered, her posts ridiculed, and her reputation in tatters. She tried to recover by posting half-hearted apologies and further distortions, but it only made things worse. People who had once admired her turned their backs. The whispers that followed her at social gatherings grew louder, and the judgment was undeniable. Her social media accounts, once filled with curated vacations, family photos, and happy moments, became silent. Each new post from Heather was met with a barrage of public ridicule, and she could no longer avoid the harsh reality of what she had done. But the consequences weren't just professional. Her relationship with Paul began to deteriorate as well. He had always been distant, but the trial had exposed things he could no longer ignore. The weight of his guilt, his failure to protect his daughter, hung heavily between them. He began to withdraw further, avoiding their conversations, staying late at work, and giving her the cold shoulder at home. Heather, for the first time, found herself utterly alone in the house they had once shared. One evening, Paul returned late after a long business trip, his face tired and worn. When he walked into the kitchen, Heather didn't immediately look up from the pile of unpaid bills that had accumulated since the divorce proceedings began. The financial strain, too, was more than either of them had anticipated. "Paul," Heather said quietly, her voice hollow, her eyes never meeting his. "This isn't what I wanted. You don't understand, it's her fault. It's Maggie. She's the one who—" He interrupted, his voice low and firm. "Heather, I can't do this anymore. I've been thinking about it, and I can't ignore it. The way you treated Lily, the way you dismissed everything. I don't even know who you are anymore." Her breath caught in her throat as his words hit her like a punch. She opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. For the first time, she saw it. Paul's disgust, his disappointment in her, and she realized he was already emotionally gone. "I need space, Heather," Paul continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving." He left their home that night, staying with a friend. It wasn't the first time they'd fought, but it was the first time Heather had felt him slip away in this way. He didn't come back the next day, nor the day after. And when he finally did, it was to gather his things, confirming what Heather had known deep down. Their marriage was over. The fallout from the trial, the loss of his family, was a wound he couldn't heal. Maggie, on the other hand, was doing everything she could to make sure Lily had a stable, supportive future. One of the first things she did, even before the court ruling, was donate part of her savings to Lily's school, ensuring that her education would be secure, regardless of the financial strain they might face. It was a small act, but it was her way of securing the future she had promised Lily. Janet, ever supportive, threw a party at her cafe to celebrate Maggie's legal victory and the peace they had found. The cafe, filled with laughter, good food, and friendly faces, was a testament to the life Maggie and Lily had built together. Janet had always been Maggie's closest confidant, but now she was the embodiment of everything that was right in Maggie's world. As the evening wore on, the group gathered around a table, laughter echoing throughout the room when the door creaked open. Paul stepped inside, his face drawn and tired, his eyes darting between the familiar faces in the room. Maggie didn't even have time to brace herself before he spoke. "Maggie," he said, his voice flat, "can we talk?" Lily, who had been happily chatting with Janet, stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she looked up at Maggie, then back at Paul. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "Paul, we don't need to have this conversation now," Maggie said, her voice steady, though her insides churned. "What do you want?" I've I've left Heather," Paul said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "She's spiraling. I don't know what to do anymore." Maggie's stomach twisted. She didn't know how to respond. Did he expect to be welcomed here? But before she could say anything, Lily stood up slowly, her eyes locked on Paul. "You left her?" Lily's voice was soft but strong. "Are you here to make things better? Because you didn't protect me before." Maggie looked at Lily, a knot forming in her chest. She wasn't sure how this conversation would end, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, she would protect Lily. Always. And the future? It was theirs to define. The knock at the door came in the middle of a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the house was still wrapped in the comfort of late-rising warmth. Maggie hadn't expected anyone, not today. Not in the calm after the storm of the past few weeks. But there it was again. Another knock. Hesitant and heavy. Maggie set down the book she was reading, glancing toward the door with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She already knew who it was. It had been weeks since the last time Paul showed up unannounced, and despite her best attempts to prepare herself, the sight of him standing on her doorstep was enough to make her stomach twist. Lily was upstairs, likely still curled up in her room, maybe drawing or reading. Maggie's gaze lingered for a moment longer on the closed door, unsure whether she should even open it. The last conversation they'd had, Paul's admission that he'd left Heather, had left a lingering, uncomfortable silence between them. But still, she had no choice. She had to face him. Maggie walked to the door, her steps slow but firm. When she opened it, there he was. Paul stood in the doorway, wearing a coat that looked too heavy for the weather, his eyes tired, his face drawn with a mixture of frustration and resignation. In his hands he carried a duffel bag and a smaller suitcase, the weight of it clearly more than just physical. He looked up at her, his mouth opening as if he had rehearsed what he was going to say, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just stood there, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something that Maggie couldn't quite place. "Paul," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "What are you doing here?" I can't go back there, Maggie," he muttered, his voice lower than usual, like he was unsure of his own intentions. She's gone off the deep end. I don't know what to do. I just need somewhere to stay." Maggie stared at him for a moment, feeling a pang of something. Sympathy, maybe? But it was buried under the layers of anger and hurt she'd carried for years. She couldn't just let him in. Not yet. "You can't stay here," she said softly, though she felt the weight of the words as they left her mouth. "I can't let you just walk back into Lily's life after everything that's happened. You've been absent, Paul. You don't get to come and go as you please." He flinched at the sharpness in her voice, but he didn't back away. I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "I screwed up. I should have been there. But I'm here now, and I just need something. Please." Maggie crossed her arms, her heart warring between the compassion she still felt for the man she once called her son and the fierce protectiveness that Lily had awakened in her. "You can't just show up with bags and expect things to go back to normal, Paul," she replied, her voice firm. "But I can allow visits. You can see Lily, but only under her terms. Not yours. Not anymore." Lily had come to her own understanding over the weeks. Maggie had carefully prepared her for what might come next, for the fact that her father might want to step back into her life, but Maggie would never push Lily into something she wasn't ready for. Paul nodded, his eyes sinking into the weight of Maggie's words. There was a brief, fleeting moment of pride in her. He had at least heard her, or at least, she thought he had. "I get it," he said finally, his voice small. "Just, I can't go back to that house. Not with her. Maggie paused, looking at the bags in his hands. There was a long silence before she finally spoke again. You can leave your things here for now, she said. But understand, Paul, this isn't an open invitation. You're here for Lily. You're here for her. Or you're not here at all. Lily appeared at the top of the stairs then, looking down at them with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Maggie held her gaze for a moment before speaking softly. Lily, come downstairs. Your father's here. Lily hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Paul before looking back at Maggie. Her expression was conflicted. Confusion, anger, and hurt all fighting for dominance on her face. But she nodded, slowly walking down the stairs. Dad, Lily said quietly when she reached the bottom, standing next to Maggie. Her voice was cautious, a sharp contrast to the vibrant, confident girl she had become. What do you want? Paul looked at her, his expression faltering. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He swallowed, his hands trembling slightly as he set the bags down by the door. I wanted to see you. I know I haven't been there, but I'm trying now. I'll do better, Lily. I promise. Lily said nothing for a long moment, just looking at him with an unreadable expression. Maggie could see the walls Lily had carefully built around her heart in the months since the trial. They were still standing, unbreached. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice low but steady. I don't need promises. I just need someone who'll be there when it matters. Not just when it's easy. Paul winced at the words, his shoulders sagging even further. He looked to Maggie for support, but she only nodded, her face unreadable. I'll go, he said, standing up slowly. I needed to hear it. I needed to know I wasn't completely gone. Lily's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her boundaries were clear, and for the first time in a long time, Maggie could see the power Lily had taken back over her own life. Paul left quietly, his footsteps heavy as he moved down the driveway, back into the world he had abandoned. As the door closed behind him, Lily let out a deep breath. She walked over to Maggie, her hand once again finding hers, and for a moment, the world outside felt smaller. Maggie pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the weight of everything they had been through and everything they had survived. And for the first time in months, Lily smiled. A real smile, full of relief. The future was theirs. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the neighborhood as Maggie stood on the front step, looking down at Lily beside her. The air was crisp, and the world felt freshly awakened, as if the weight of everything they'd been through was finally lifting. Lily stood tall, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. She looked different now, more confident, more at ease. There was no tension in her shoulders, no hesitation in her step. She was walking into her life, into a future that felt full of possibility. Maggie squeezed her hand and they began walking down the sidewalk side by side, the morning quiet around them. Maggie watched Lily, taking in the subtle changes, the way her daughter, her real daughter now, was finally beginning to shine again. She was not the fragile, withdrawn girl who had walked into Maggie's life months ago, but someone entirely new, someone full of promise. As they reached the school gate, a few teachers who were arriving early waved at them, their smiles warm and full of genuine care. Mrs. Hamilton, the teacher who had spoken so highly of Lily in court, was standing near the entrance, waving as well. "Good morning, Lily," Mrs. Hamilton called out with a bright smile. "It's so good to see you back here, so full of energy. We've missed you." Lily's face lit up. "Good morning, Mrs. Hamilton," she said, her voice steady and full of confidence. The teacher waved back, clearly delighted by the change in the girl who had once barely interacted with her classmates. Maggie felt a swell of pride in her chest as she watched them exchange a few words. Her eyes lingered on Lily for a moment longer. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. They walked a little further, and Maggie noticed a familiar figure approaching. Janet, carrying a basket of muffins in her hands, her eyes twinkling with warmth. Maggie smiled, a small but deep satisfaction settling over her. "Here she comes," Janet said, grinning as she handed Lily a muffin. "I thought you might need a little something extra to start the day, right?" Lily accepted the muffin with a smile, the simple gesture a reminder of how far they had all come, the way people like Janet had shown up when it mattered most. The world, it seemed, had started to make room for Lily again, and it was no longer a place full of shadows and silence. "Thank you, Janet," Lily said, her voice bright. She turned to Maggie, her hand still firmly held in hers. "You've really made this all happen, Grandma. I can feel it. I feel like I belong here now." Maggie's throat tightened with emotion, and she bent down to kiss Lily's forehead. "You belong here," she whispered softly. "You always have. It's just that the world took too long to realize it." As the bell rang, signaling the start of school, Lily turned to face Maggie, her eyes full of something Maggie hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. She hugged Maggie tightly, her small arms wrapping around her with a quiet strength that made Maggie's heart swell. "Thank you," Lily whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for being my safe place." Maggie pulled back slightly, looking at Lily, her face still glowing with that inner peace. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. I'm your safe place because you've always been mine. And now we're building something. Together." Lily smiled through her tears, nodding as if the weight of the world had finally been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Maggie didn't feel the crushing responsibility of doing it all alone. She had been the one to answer the call when Lily begged, and now, as the child she had kept close walked toward her future, Maggie knew she had done something right. As Lily walked into the school, Maggie stood there for a moment, watching her go. The future was still unknown, still full of uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Maggie was filled with an unshakable sense of peace. The fight was over. The damage had been done, but they had made it through. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Richard, the final custody papers attached. Maggie opened the email, her hands steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. She scanned the document quickly, her heart racing as she read the final words. Permanent custody granted to Maggie Collins. Her eyes watered, but she blinked them away quickly. She had won. They had won. The life they would build from here was theirs to define, and no one could take it away. Maggie smiled, watching the door to the school close behind Lily. With a full heart, she whispered the words she had been holding inside all this time. They ignored her plea, but I heard it, and I never let go.